I interviewed my subject's mother, I'll call her Mary. She's an elementary school teacher in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And the subject of my interview is Freddie, a 10-year-old boy who lives with his parents and younger siblings. He was diagnosed with multiple disabilities under IDEA. And so my presentation is going to break down the multiple stories that led to each diagnosis. By the time Freddie was 2 years old, Mary noticed he wasn't talking. As he was her first child, she didn't know if it was normal, so she spoke to the pediatrician. He initiated an assessment for early intervention, which is covered under Part C of IDEA for children from age birth to 2. The assessment took place in Mary's home, where a team of women conducted a play-based evaluation, and he was found eligible for IE services. His family worked with the team to develop an IFSP, which outlined his qualifications for speech therapy. When he aged out of EI on his 3rd birthday, he qualified for an IEP under the IDEA guidelines. He qualified to attend a free preschool for children with disabilities where he received social work services with his peers and individualized speech therapy. He was mostly silent at school, but by the age of 3, he started to communicate, but he was still struggling with articulation. In kindergarten, he was placed in a gen ed class that had a cluster of children with disabilities, and a special education teacher would come into the class to support the kids. In 1st grade, he was reevaluated and diagnosed with a disability under speech or language impairment. The school stopped providing the push-in special education teacher to help in class, which left him struggling. The only push-in teacher was the teacher for the ESL teacher for Spanish speakers, who saw him struggling and went out of her way to support him. In preschool, Mary noticed some behavioral differences between Freddie and his peers. At the end of the school day, he would be so immersed in an activity that she would struggle to take him home while the other kids just stopped and left. He struggled with self-control and appropriate social interactions. He would be so excited to hang out with his friends that he would jump on them, and he lacked the awareness of the negative effects of his behavior on the other kids. His kindergarten teacher also noticed that he would become easily distracted and wander around the class in the middle of lesson. At his IEP meeting in 1st grade, Mary asked about assessing him for ADHD. He was evaluated using the Connors rating scales, which consist of questionnaires filled out by his teachers and parents. The school psychologist also performed an observational evaluation. The scales were sent to his pediatrician, and he was diagnosed with ADHD and given medication. His IEP was modified now to include the diagnosis under other health impairment, and he also received 2 new accommodations, extra time and preferential seating. Mary's best friend had known Freddie since before he was born and had her own children with disabilities, and so she was her biggest support because she could share her lived experiences and perspectives from parenting children with disabilities. Her friend noticed Freddie's medication was affecting his personality, so she spoke to the pediatrician and they decided to take him off his meds before starting 3rd grade. He began acting more like himself, but he was all over the place and completely unregulated at school. Mary said the teacher helped him stay focused by reminding him throughout the day, and at home she would sit with him to do homework to keep him on track. Toward the end of the year, Mary spoke again with the pediatrician, and they prescribed him a different medication to alleviate his symptoms that also had less side effects. In regards to his family life, his siblings were too young to know he had a disability, but they did notice that he took medication and asked if they would have to take medication one day also. The biggest impact on his parents was Freddie's daily struggle with hyperactivity and distractibility, 2 of the common characteristics of ADHD. Keeping him focused was a frustrating struggle, and as he was easily distracted, normal daily tasks took longer than expected. His hyperactivity affected his social interactions because it had interfered with his ability to have appropriate relationships with friends, as other kids found his behavior annoying and overwhelming. In kindergarten, when the other children were learning to read, Freddie was struggling with letter recognition and phonetics. He was behind his peers and gradually got further behind. When he got into 1st grade, everyone in his district took the developmental reading assessment to identify exceptional students, and Freddie scored below expectations. He was placed in a reading recovery program, which is a multi-week program that supplements classroom reading lessons. It's an example of a multi-tiered system of support where the lowest scoring students go to the program and they get reevaluated to determine their progress. Freddie's IEP meeting was scheduled after he completed the program, and he had not improved. In fact, his mother was told that that was expected, but he needed to go through the program before any alternatives could be considered. This is an example of a response to intervention where an accommodation was implemented, subsequent reevaluation was completed to assess the progress, and then follow-up interventions were suggested. By 2nd grade, he began shutting down from all the stress. He was reading words backwards, flipping letters, and he was showing inconsistencies decoding specific words from sentence to sentence. Mary asked if there were possibly issues with dyslexia, but was told that it was considered normal struggle for his grade level. And furthermore, she was told that any results from an evaluation would be inaccurate because of his young age. She was reassured that he was getting all the accommodations he needed regardless of his diagnosis, which now included the addition of being seated next to a good student role model and having directions broken down into smaller steps. She noted the interaction with the school was a great experience for her because she and her son both were shown genuine care and support. By the end of second grade, he was a year behind in his ability to read. When he entered third grade, he was considered to be at an appropriate age to receive the accurate results for an assessment, and Mary requested his IEP meeting be pushed up. He was evaluated and diagnosed with specific learning disability in reading. He qualified for special education services for reading support outside the gen ed class. Mary also enrolled Freddie in after-school tutoring to help him read. As a middle-class family, she was able to endure the extra financial burden so her son could get the best support she could offer. Freddie's third grade teacher was incredibly unsupportive, and he interpreted Freddie's behavior as defiant and obstinate. Mary said this was the first and only time she experienced school staff negatively impacting her son's growth as a student with a disability. She noticed Freddie beginning to display behaviors unlike his peers. He was very rigid, he was struggling with social interactions, and bullied. He couldn't control his emotional reactions, which resulted in fights with his classmates, meltdowns, and more bullying. He struggled with executive functioning, and he needed more support. Mary expressed her concerns to her mother-in-law, who was a school principal, and she suggested he be evaluated for autism spectrum disorder. She spoke to the social worker at the school, and he was assessed through the childhood autism rating scales, which consist of questionnaires filled out by his teachers and parents and an observed evaluation by the school social worker. The results from the school showed a rating of moderate to severe, while the results from his parents were mild. Mary struggled with the idea that her son was really on the autism spectrum, but the school psychologist explained that either way, the label wouldn't have a negative impact. Freddie was getting the accommodations and the support that he would need to succeed. The label would be most helpful for teachers and adults in his life, specifically for someone like his third grade teacher. It would allow the adults to see his behavior through the lens of a child struggling with a disability instead of just being a bad kid. And Mary said this really helped her through the process of accepting his diagnosis. Freddie's parents experienced negative impact of his disability. When attempting to discipline him, he would often shut down. A surprising positive impact of his disability was from Freddie's immaturity compared to his peers, because although he was a few years older than his sister, their equal maturity level put them on an even playing field and allowed their friendship to really flourish. In general, Mary has concerns for his future because she worries about the impacts of his academic accomplishments, social interactions, and future independence. Her son's needs are still evolving as he grows and progresses, especially now that remote learning is in process. They're working daily to come up with good management techniques. Freddie's disability at school has had the most impact on his speech and reading, but he is at grade level in math and he loves science and social studies. Mary focused her responses about support as it relates to herself, as she was the interviewee. She said she had the support of her friends and coworkers, and as a teacher, she could ask the social worker and school psychologist in her district for their opinion because she can trust them and she knows them well. Having a son with disabilities has helped Mary in her career as a teacher because she's more understanding of her students and can identify a student struggling as opposed to misbehaving. Mary comes from a family of educators and has a master's in education, which has helped her navigate through the school system, as she has been in IEP meetings both as a teacher and a parent, so she can sympathize with the staff at her son's IEP meetings. Additionally, education is highly valued in her family, so she sees how supporting her son will positively impact his future. Freddie's parents are white and middle class, and Mary knows the right questions to ask and the right way to ask them, allowing her to be taken seriously when getting support for her son. She's cognizant of how his teachers perceive her. She's not dismissed when addressing school staff, which she has seen happen to parents from lower socioeconomic statuses and minority backgrounds. To the parents of students with disabilities, she emphasizes to not get hung up on labels. They're in place to ensure the child is getting the best support for their needs. And she understands it can be scary to see it officially labeled as an IEP, but it's beneficial. Except for Freddie's third grade teacher, all of her staff interactions have been positive. They've been supportive and caring and available for her when she has questions, and they've gone the distance to make sure he gets the support he needs to succeed. And she said this is how all future teachers should treat the process and see their students. Future teachers should be direct with parents and don't be afraid to explain an issue, and definitely don't keep any information hidden from parents. As a teacher, Mary said, advocate for your students. Two students can be diagnosed with the same disability and present in totally different ways. So it's important to learn each of their individual needs and backgrounds. She noted another helpful tip that as a teacher, you can reach out to the student's previous teachers and other teachers that are currently working with the child, and they can give advice based on their own personal interactions with that child. And finally, she said to remember that the family knows their child best. So if you have any questions and you need to get to know more about their kid, reach out to the parents. And those are my references.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel.